Chapter 1, The Garden Show at Street. Mildred's the village of Milchester was, in the words of its own Women's Society president, a most respectable sort of place and unspectacular, but blessedly so. It lay nestled between soft green hills and quiet, winding lanes, the kind of English village where the most serious disruptions were usually late deliveries from the bakery or disputes over whose begonias had taken the first prize. And on that particular Saturday, the only thing that seemed remotely exciting was the street. Mildred's annual garden show. The marquee had been raised the day before on the vicarage lawn, a large white canvas tent fluttering gently in the breeze. There were stalls of sponge cakes and preserves, ranks of dahlias and chrysanthemums standing to attention, and the inevitable competition for best homegrown vegetable, which was, as always, fiercely contested. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the prize marrow display, was knitting a dove-gray sock and watching the proceedings with mild interest. "I do believe Mrs. Constance Blackwell's hydrangeas have suffered this year," murmured Miss Hartnell, peering through her pince-nez. "They're nowhere near their usual plumpness." "That's the thing about hydrangeas," Miss Marple said softly, eyes never lifting from her needles, "they don't respond well to tension in the household." Miss Hartnell looked confused, but had no time to reply before the voice of Reverend Pilling echoed from the speakers. "And now, dear villagers, the judges have reached their decision in the floral arrangements category. Please make your way to the central tent to broken bar." As the crowd surged forward with a mixture of curiosity and pride, a loud, shrill scream pierced the summer air. It came from just behind the potting stall near the edge of the vicarage orchard. The effect was instantaneous. People turned in unison, stallholders froze with scones half wrapped, and children dropped their toffee apples. Miss Marple, quite unhurriedly, placed her knitting in her handbag, rose from her chair, and began walking toward the commotion. The scream had come from Sally Briggs, a young girl of 17, fresh-faced and anxious, who worked as an assistant to the town's only horticultural supplier. She stood trembling beside the low garden wall, her hands covering her mouth. "Yeah, I was going to fetch more compost bags from behind the greenhouse," she stammered to anyone who would listen. "And I tripped on him." There, half concealed behind a stack of flower crates, lay the body of Mr. Harold Fothergill. He was sprawled awkwardly on his back, one arm flung over his head, the other tucked beneath him. His face was waxen and oddly peaceful, with only the faintest smear of soil across one cheek. A small trowel lay nearby. He wore his usual gardening smock, a coarse gray-blue garment with wide front pockets. Dr. Anthony Braithwaite, summoned within moments, crouched beside the body. "Dead," he confirmed flatly, checking the wrist and shaking his head. "And not by natural causes, I'd wager." Miss Marple stood just outside the circle that had formed, her blue eyes alert beneath the modest brim of her straw hat. "How extraordinary," she murmured, almost to herself. "One never imagines a man so particular about his mulch to be found so very untidy." "Do you think he was poisoned, Jane?" asked Miss Hartnell, now pale with morbid interest. "Oh no," Miss Marple replied gently. "The body isn't right for poison. But something about this is disarranged." Mr. Fothergill was not the kind of man to lie down on damp earth unless absolutely necessary. Heart attack, perhaps? Perhaps, Miss Marple said, though her tone suggested otherwise. It was soon clear that the police had been notified. Sergeant Paris, a well-meaning man of limited imagination, was already cordoning off the area with polite efficiency. His expression turned grave as he approached Miss Marple, whom he had known since boyhood. "Terrible business, ma'am," he said. "We'll need to get statements from everyone present." "Looks suspicious, to be honest." Miss Marple nodded. "Mr. Fothergill was not without his enemies, I'm afraid." Paris blinked. "Enemies? Old Harold?" "But he was just. He grew dahlias and barked at teenagers." "Sometimes," said Miss Marple delicately, "those who bark do so to hide the fact that they've been biting all along." She drifted toward the body again while the constable was busy noting down names. No one else had yet noticed that one pocket of Mr. Fothergill's smock bulged oddly. The other pocket was flat. And as a passing breeze stirred the edge of the garment, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a glimmer of paper, torn and crumpled, barely visible from the right-hand pocket. She didn't touch it. But she noted it all the same. And she remembered, too, that not 20 minutes ago, she had seen Mr. Arthur Welby Fothergill's quiet neighbor and sometime rival in the Marrow competition slinking away from the greenhouse path with his coat collar turned up despite the warm weather. The garden show, it seemed, would not be remembered for its tea or begonias after all. It would be remembered for the day respectable Harold Fothergill was found dead beside his compost, and for the strange little clue sticking out of the pocket of his gardening smock. Chapter 2, Tea, Theories, and a torn piece of paper. By the following morning, the garden show grounds had been cleared, but the air in Milchester was far from calm. Rumors spread like dandelion fluff caught in a breeze. Some villagers claimed Harold Fothergill had been found clutching a message in his fist. Others insisted he had muttered someone's name before expiring, as though no one could quite agree on which name. At least 3 different people claimed to have witnessed the moment Sally Briggs stumbled across the body, and all 3 told conflicting accounts. At the Rose Thistle Tea Room, the unofficial seat of village gossip, the talk was thick as clotted cream. "I always said he was a difficult man," declared Mrs. Emery, who taught piano to the vicar's nieces and considered herself perceptive in all things psychological. "His temper, you know. Just last week he shouted at Geraldine Platt for letting her cat use his garden as well, you know." "Yes, but he wasn't murderous," said Mr. Godfrey Peel, the retired magistrate. "There's a difference between a temper and a death wish." "Perhaps he didn't have the wish," murmured Miss Winstanley, a librarian with a voice so faint one had to lean in to hear it, "but someone else might have had." At a corner table, quietly sipping her tea, sat Miss Marple. Her blue eyes scanned the room not in suspicion but in sympathy. She knew the patterns of village reaction: first the shock, then the gossip, then the dangerous conviction that everyone knew what had happened. And, invariably, everyone was wrong. Sergeant Paris had made his initial inquiries and was already leaning toward a theory of accident. "Could have tripped, hit his head on a rock, And the odd angly well, that could be explained, he had said to her the night before, not unkindly. No sign of struggle. No wound. Not even a bruise large enough to raise eyebrows. Miss Marple had nodded then, but her mind had moved elsewhere, to the torn bit of paper protruding from Harold Fothergill's smock, and to the fact that it had been hastily bagged by the constable before she could see more than a glimpse of dark ink line as a what looked suspiciously like a name, though too fragmented to decipher. By late afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking through the village square, parasol gently bobbing at her side. She turned left past the old bakery and paused in front of Ivy Cottage, a modest but well-kept house with trim hedges and a neatly painted gate. The plaque on the door read, "Arthur Welby, a botanical illustrator." Mr. Welby was not often visited. He was a widower of precise habits, who kept to himself and rarely came into the village except for the fortnightly market. But Miss Marple remembered quite clearly seeing him near the greenhouse during the show and, more importantly, seeing him walk away before the commotion began. She rang the bell. There was a long pause before the door opened. Mr. Welby appeared, wearing a housecoat, his hair slightly disheveled as though he had not expected visitors. His thin face was marked with age but not neglect. His eyes pale, quick regarded her with guarded politeness. "Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his glasses. "This is unexpected." "I do apologize," she said gently, "but I hoped you might spare me a few minutes. It's such a dreadful business about Mr. Fothergill." He stepped back to let her in. The hallway smelled of ink and drying leaves. Botanical sketches were pinned neatly along the walls, mostly lilies, ferns, and rare orchids. He led her to a small sitting room, where the afternoon sun streamed in through embroidered curtains. "I didn't know him well," Mr. Welby said abruptly as he poured her tea without being asked. "Though I suppose people will say we were rivals." Miss Marple accepted the cup, letting the silence hang just long enough to give him space to fill it. "He always had to win," Welby went on, "every contest, every season. Marrows, roses, the village quiz night, even the raffle. I dare say it made him enemies. But that doesn't mean he stopped." "I'm not suggesting anything of the sort," Miss Marple said with a calm smile. "I only wondered if you happened to see him yesterday." "You were near the potting stall shortly before the discovery." Welby set down his cup with a soft clink. "I walked past, yes. I thought I saw a slug on one of my geranium entries and went to remove it. But I never spoke to him. And then I returned home. I don't care for large crowds." Miss Marple nodded. "Understandable. Still, it's peculiar." Mr. Fothergill was found with something in his pocket. "A bit of paper." Welby's eyes flicked to her, then away. "Paper?" "Just the edge visible. Looked like a note, or perhaps a label." "It's odd, really." Harold was meticulous. he wouldn't carry torn bits around. Unless, of course, it was important. Welby said nothing. His hands had stilled in his lap, fingers interlaced too tightly. "I remember dear Minnie Townsley," Miss Marple continued casually, "who used to hoard shopping lists in her apron pockets. It's how we discovered she'd been stealing jam. She wrote it down, you see, to keep track of flavors." Mr. Welby gave a faint, nervous chuckle, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What an odd thing to confess in a garden murder." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, I wasn't confessing, dear Mr. Welby. Only reminiscing." When she left 20 minutes later, she carried with her no confession, no scandal, but something else entirely, a sense that Mr. Welby was hiding not guilt, but fear. And in Miss Marple's experience, fear often pointed to knowledge rather than action. As she walked back past the vicarage wall, her thoughts were interrupted by a loud call from across the square. "Miss Marple! Miss Marple, just a moment." It was young Sally Briggs, still pale, but clearly mustering courage. She hurried over, nearly tripping over a flower-bed border. "Yeah, I'm sorry to bother you," she said breathlessly. "But I remembered something." "About yesterday?" "Yes, my dear." "I'm not sure if it's anything important, but before I found Mr. Fothergill I saw someone come from behind the greenhouse." "A woman?" "I only caught the back of her coat. But it was green velvet, I'm certain." "Green velvet?" Miss Marple repeated, her brows lifting. "Yes. And the strange thing is, the only person I've ever seen wear something like that is Mrs. Prunella Simmons. From the far side of the village." Miss Marple's mind flicked through its internal index. Mrs. Prunella Simmons, early 60s, widow of a solicitor, said to be fond of sherry and dramatics. And yes, she did wear a green velvet coat with a ridiculous fox fur collar. "How interesting," Miss Marple said softly. "Interesting indeed." Because Prunella Simmons had once been very friendly with Harold Fothergill. Too friendly, according to some. And green velvet wasn't something easily mistaken or overlooked. Miss Marple looked up at the church steeple in the distance, its shadow long on the green. The village was already cracking at the edges. And something, perhaps the note, perhaps the velvet, or perhaps the expression on Mr. Welby's fascia, told her the roots of this crime went deeper than anyone yet realized. Chapter 3, Velvet and Vexations. By mid-morning the next day, the green velvet coat was the subject of more discussion than the murder itself. Mrs. Prunella Simmons, as it happened, was not unaware of her coat's notoriety. She had worn it with flair for several winters, always accompanied by her prized fox fur collar, and was rather pleased to be remembered for it. But being linked to a murder, even by way of fabric, had not been in her plans. When Miss Marple arrived at her gate that morning, Prunella was already in the drawing-room, nursing a sherry before noon and fuming in what could only be described as controlled indignation. "I've heard the whispers, Jane," she said, with the dramatic air of someone ready to take the stand in a courtroom. Sally Briggs says she saw someone in green velvet near the greenhouse. I ask you, how many green velvets can a village sustain? Honestly. Well, said Ms. Marple mildly, you must admit yours is quite distinctive. That's hardly a crime. Certainly not. But might I ask, did you attend the garden show on Saturday? I most certainly did. I arrived just after 2. I saw the mayor's wife judging the sponge cakes with an expression of thinly veiled disdain. I saw Constance Blackwell's hydrangeas wilting like limp lettuce. And I left before 3. Left alone? Prunella paused, a flicker of calculation in her eyes. Yes. I wonder, Miss Marple said, eyes drifting to the mantelpiece, whether you might have seen Mr. Fothergill that day. Perhaps you exchanged a word? Good heavens, no, Prunella said too quickly. We haven't spoken in, well, not properly since last November. Ah, yes. The committee meeting. It had been one of those minor but telling episodes that only a village like Milchester could birth and remember. The Harvest F.A. superscript 8 Fund Committee had devolved into chaos after Mr. Fothergill accused Prunella Simmons of inappropriate expenses in regard to the floral archway. She, in turn, had accused him of being a man of suspiciously precise opinions. There had been raised voices, red cheeks, and by most accounts a few barely veiled threats of public embarrassment. Water under the bridge, said Prunella with a dismissive wave. Besides, Harold never had the guts to follow through on anything scandalous. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Oh, my dear, it's not scandal I think of, but disappointment. It's a most dangerous thing, especially in older men. Prunella flushed a little but said nothing more. As Miss Marple stood to leave, she cast one last glance at the hall where the green velvet coat hung neatly on a brass hook, its cuffs dusted with something faintly pally, perhaps flour, perhaps pollen. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat once more at her favorite corner of the rose thistle, enjoying a simple luncheon of cress sandwiches and weak Darjeeling. Outside, the clouds had begun to gather in slow-moving clusters, casting a strange light on the village square. She had just stirred her tea for the 3rd time when she was joined by a figure who rarely ventured out in daylight, a Mr. Basil Grover, the village solicitor. Miss Marple, he said, sliding into the seat across from her, I do hate to intrude upon a lady's tea, but I thought you should know something. About Harold. Please, said Miss Marple, do sit properly. You look as though you're about to deliver a verdict. Basil gave a small, nervous chuckle. It's not that grave. But something occurred to me. Harold came to see me last week. Said he wanted to make changes to his will. Changes? Yes. Nothing too dramatic, mind you. But he wanted to remove someone from the list of secondary beneficiaries. Who? Arthur Welby. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been dormant, stirred faintly in her bag. Really? But they were hardly close. They were once, Basil said. Years ago, when Harold's wife passed, Arthur was very supportive. They bonded over gardening, of all things. But something shifted recently. Harold didn't say why, only that he no longer wished for Mr. Welby to benefit in the event of unfortunate happenstance. His words, not mine. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And did he make the change? Number. We were due to finalize the paperwork this week. The timing couldn't be ignored. A man on the verge of altering his will, a man who then dies mysteriously before doing so. And the man set to loose from that revision just happened to be lingering near the scene. As Basil left with a polite tip of his hat, Miss Marple turned back to her teacup, though her thoughts were far from the taste of bergamot. Meanwhile, in the dim back room of the police station, Sergeant Parris sat frowning at the collected statements. He wasn't a clever man, but he was a careful one, and something about the whole business refused to sit right with him. He stared again at the item taken from Harold Fothergill's smock pocket, a torn slip of paper. It had finally been dried and flattened out by Constable Roper. Just a fragment really, with only a few lines visible. A broken bar must tell her before a broken bar, the rest was ragged, incomplete. Parris tapped his pencil against the desk. Tell who what before what? The slip had no address, no signature, nothing to suggest its context. And yet. He rose from his desk and walked across to the evidence tray. A second item had been found just that morning by one of the groundskeepers, nearly missed, a small lapel pin, shaped like a fox's head, nestled in the grass not far from the compost sacks. Looks like it broke off a brooch, Roper had said. Bit fancy. Parris examined it again now. Fox's head. It reminded him of something. Of course. Prunella Simmons' green velvet coat. The one with the fur collar and matching fox head clasp. His brow furrowed deeper. Back at Street. Mary Mead Cottage, Miss Marple was brushing crumbs from her tablecloth when she heard the faint knock at the door. It was Sally Briggs again, red-eyed, anxious, her coat thrown over one arm. "I'm sorry, I just had to come," she said. "I remembered something else. About that note in his pocket." "Yes, Sally?" "When I found him, it wasn't just sticking out. It was folded, like it had been tucked in carefully. And it looked like it had been torn recently. As if he was writing and someone pulled it from him, or he tore it himself." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That's very helpful, my dear." Sally hesitated. "Do you think it was a message? For someone?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "it was a secret." And secrets, when disturbed, tend to unravel everything around them. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the rose trellis that clung to the front porch. A coat with pale powder on the cuffs. A note nearly lost. A change in a will unmade. and now a broken fox-head pin. The murder, Miss Marple knew, was not a crime of rage. It was a crime of timing, and timing, in a village like Milchester, was always deliberate. Chapter 4, A Visitor in the Night. It was just past 9 o'clock in the evening when Relevant Pilling, having locked away the hymnals and dimmed the lanterns in the nave, caught sight of a figure lingering just outside the churchyard gate. Normally, such sightings might be dismissed as one of the village's many nocturnal wanderers. Mrs. Finch from the dairy, for example, often forgot whether she'd latched her goat pen and wandered out in her slippers. But this figure was tall, still, and rather more composed. And it was Arthur Welby. "Arthur?" the Relevant called gently. The figure turned. Mr. Welby appeared startled, though not frightened, more like a man caught mid-thought. His overcoat hung awkwardly on his lean frame, and in the lantern light, his cheeks seemed drawn. "I was just walking," he said, as the Relevant approached. "Couldn't sleep?" The Relevant gave a kindly nod. "Understandable, given the week." "A dreadful thing." "Poor Harold." "Yes." There was a pause. Wind stirred the birch trees at the far end of the graveyard, and somewhere in the distance, a nightjar let out its plaintive cry. "You knew him well once, didn't you?" the Relevant asked, almost cautiously. "We were friends," Arthur said, after a beat. "Long ago." "Things changed." "Things often do." Welby looked up suddenly. Do you think people believe I killed him?" The Relevant was taken aback. "Well, I should hope not." "I've heard no such thing." "But they're thinking it." "They saw me near the greenhouse." "They know about the will." Pilling hesitated. "That was confidential, wasn't it?" Arthur offered a hollow smile. "In this village? Nothing is truly confidential." He turned toward the gate, paused, then said softly, "He said he'd ruin me." "Pardon?" "Last month. We had words." He was angry. "Over something I'd said. Something that happened years ago. I didn't think he meant it seriously. But then he started leaving notes. Cryptic little things in my letterbox." "Did you keep them?" Arthur shook his head. "I burned them." "Foolish, maybe. But I didn't want to give them life by keeping them." The Relevant watched as Welby stepped back into the shadows, his form swallowed slowly by night and hedgerow. The door of the church creaked gently behind him, and the wind picked up again, soft and steady like a breath held too long. The next morning, Miss Marple was visited by an unexpected call. Constable Roper, red-faced and apologetic, his cap clutched in both hands. "Miss Marple," he said, "Sergeant Paris sent me." "He'd rather not go himself, said you'd be gentler on the ears." "Very flattering," she replied dryly. "Do come in." He stepped inside, careful not to tread on the Persian rug. "It's about the note. The one we found in Mr. Fothergill's pocket." "Oh?" "We've had it looked at again. There's ink residue on the opposite corner, suggesting there was more to it, another sheet, maybe. But what's odd is the handwriting. It doesn't match anything we've seen from Harold." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "You mean it might have been written to him?" "Possibly. And the part that survived must tell her before the inspector thinks it was something urgent. A confession maybe. Or a warning." Constable Roper shifted. "There's something else. We received an anonymous envelope. No note inside, just this." He reached into his satchel and pulled out a plastic evidence pouch. Inside was a photograph of faded, dog-eared. Miss Marple adjusted her glasses and looked closer. It showed 3 people in front of the village greenhouse, a much younger Harold Fothergill, laughing. Beside him, a younger Mrs. Prunella Simmons, clearly affectionate, her hand resting on Harold's arm. And to the far left, standing slightly apart, was Arthur Welby. His expression, even in the old photograph, was strained. "Where was this found?" Ms. Marple asked. "Posted through the station letterbox sometime last night. No return address." Miss Marple stared at the photograph for moments longer. Then she stood, walked to her bookshelf, and removed a slim volume of poetry. "It's always the past, Constable," she murmured. "It always leaks through, no matter how tightly it's been sealed." That afternoon, a small group had gathered at the Rose Thistle for what had been meant as a casual committee discussion of the rescheduled harvest F***, but conversation had predictably swerved into more exciting waters. Arthur Welby was in love with Prunella Simmons, Mrs. Emery said, lowering her voice though no one nearby could possibly hear. "Don't be ridiculous," said Mr. Peel. They barely spoke after the committee row. "Exactly," said Ms. Hartnell. "That sort of tension always means something. And Harold, well, he wasn't known for his generosity." "I heard he found something," muttered someone from the next table. "Something in her attic. A letter, or a journal. That's why she killed him." Miss Marple, seated 2 tables away with her knitting, sighed inwardly. The gossip, as expected, had reached its fevered peak. But that photograph, with its stiff postures and strained smiles, had told her something the gossip hadn't. There was a triangle on Sia: Harold, Prunella, and Arthur. Not romantic perhaps, but competitive. Tense. And it had never been resolved. Miss Marple was about to leave when Sally Briggs entered, face pale once more. She moved directly to Miss Marple's table. "Yeah, I remembered something else." Miss Marple looked up, kind. "Yes, dear?" "On the morning of the garden show, I was fetching tea for the judges in the kitchen tent, Mr. Fothergill came in. He didn't see me. He was talking to someone behind the curtain. I think it was a woman. Did you hear what was said? Just a little. He said, "It ends today." I'm tired of carrying your secret. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And then he said, if you won't tell her, I will." Sally paused, biting her lip. Do you think that's what the note meant?" Miss Marple didn't answer right away. She reached into her bag and retrieved a scrap of wool, winding it into a tidy circle. "I think someone knew," she said at last, "that Harold was preparing to speak a truth long buried. Intra the lifetime he awaits for no man." Sally blinked, unsure what to say. "Thank you, my dear," Miss Marple added warmly. "That may have been the missing piece." As the girl left, Miss Marple looked once more at the photograph. 3 people, frozen in time, none of them smiling fully. Only one was still smiling now, and he was dead. But soon, Miss Marple thought, they would all be made to speak. And she already knew his silence had lasted just a little too long. Chapter 5, Secrets. Beneath the ivy that evening, the last rays of sun fell in amber streaks across the rooftops of Milchester, casting elongated shadows over the vicarage garden, the bakery awning, and the narrow lanes where secrets had taken root like stubborn weeds. Inside her neat sitting room, Miss Marple sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, not knitting, not reading, just thinking. In the fireplace, a small coal fire crackled, unnecessary for warmth but useful for clarity. She often found that the flicker of flames helped sort the muddled strands of human behavior into something discernible. There were too many contradictions to ignore. Arthur Welby, who claimed he hadn't spoken to Harold in months, had once been close enough to be named in a will. Mrs. Simmons, who declared her relationship with the deceased long dead, had appeared in an old photograph practically hanging off his arm. And Harold himself, meticulous to a fault, had left behind a torn note in someone else's handwriting and a broken fox head pin near his body. It wasn't coincidence. It was compression. Some pressure, emotional, reputational, or perhaps legal, it had been building. And Harold, whatever else he had been, was not the sort of man to let such things boil unchecked. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was greeted by a familiar sight, young Relevant Pilling, hat in hand and worry on his brow. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said. "Of course not, dear. Come in and sit. You look as though you've swallowed a hymn book sideways." The Relevant managed a brief chuckle before seating himself stiffly in the armchair. "I've come about something strange," he began. "After speaking with Arthur Welby the other night, I was troubled. So I went to the church archives. An unusual place for spiritual comfort. Perhaps. But I found something odd. In the vestry logbook, there's a series of notes dating back nearly 20 years. Around the time Harold's wife passed." Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence pull the Relevant forward like a tide. There were references to meetings, he continued, between Harold, Arthur, and on several occasions Prunella. All logged in by the then curate, under a rather curious title, Estate Arrangement Consultations. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. And what exactly were they arranging? That's just it. Nothing official ever came of them. There was no will registered through the church. No property transactions logged. But Harold's wife's funeral expenses were paid privately and rather generously by someone with initials matching Arthur Welby. The relevant leaned in slightly. What could they have been hiding? Miss Marple didn't reply at once. Instead, she reached for her sewing basket and retrieved a folded newspaper clipping she had set aside earlier that week. It was from the Milchester Gazette, dated 15 years prior. The headline was innocuous: Garden Show winner dedicates victory to late wife. The photograph beneath it showed Harold, smiling, beside a lavish rose display. And just behind him and unnoticed by many, but not by Miss Marple, stood a young woman in gardening overalls, her face turned slightly, eyes fixed not on the camera but on Harold. Sally Briggs. The dates didn't quite match, but the resemblance was uncanny. Jane? Reverend Pilling prompted gently. Miss Marple handed him the photograph. Have you ever wondered who raised Sally Briggs? He squinted. Her grandmother, wasn't it? They lived on the edge of the village. Parents died in a train accident, or so it was said. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. That's what's always said. I checked with the railway registry. No local accident matched that claim in the year of Sally's birth. The relevant looked up, startled. You think a question mark? I wonder, the Milchester awoke under a sky of heavy gray, the kind of sky that threatened rain but never quite delivered. It was the sort of weather that made people walk faster, speak softer, and glance over their shoulders, as if the clouds themselves were listening. Miss Marple, however, was already in her garden by 7, pruning a stubborn rosebush with gentle but precise snips. The dew clung to the hem of her skirt, and the distant toll of the chapel bell marked the hour. But her thoughts were far from the stems and thorns in her hands. The truth, she now suspected, lay not in what people had done recently but in what they had buried years ago and then quietly reshaped to suit their needs. The note in Harold's pocket, the hidden second half, the photograph from the past, the barely acknowledged parentage of Sally Briggs, all threads in a carefully concealed tapestry. And someone had tugged too hard. She had just returned to her kitchen when a knock came at the front door. Not hurried, but firm. She opened it to find Sergeant Paris standing stiffly, his notebook tucked beneath his arm. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, voice unusually clipped. "May I have a word?" "Of course, Sergeant." "Come in." "I have water just boiled." He declined the tea but took a seat at her small kitchen table, glancing around with what might have been discomfort, or simply fatigue. "We've received a new statement," he said. From a Mr. Leslie Wicks, groundskeeper at the vicarage. Miss Marple's brows lifted. He was near the potting shed that day, wasn't he? Paris nodded. Claims he saw someone enter the greenhouse shortly before the body was found. A woman, in gloves. Said he remembered because it struck him as odd, a sunny day, no mud, and yet she wore gloves. Did he see her face? Number. Just the gloves and a quick glimpse of hair. But he was certain she was holding something. A bit of paper, folded. Tucked it quickly into a coat pocket. Miss Marple's thoughts leapt immediately to Prunella's velvet coat and the fox head pin that had been found broken in the grass. She denied speaking to Harold that day, Miss Marple said softly. Paris scratched the back of his neck. She denies a lot. But there's more. Wicks didn't want to come forward at first because, well, a broken bar, he has a bit of history with Arthur Welby. Disputes over land rights on the boundary between their properties. Thought it might look personal. I imagine it was. Paris sighed. Thing is, Jenny, a broken bar, none of this is sticking. Welby had a motive, sure. But no real opportunity. Mrs. Simmons had a feud, but not enough to warrant a murder. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Unless it wasn't rage, but self-preservation. Paris glanced up. She didn't want Harold to reveal something to Sally. Something that would shatter the narrative this village has accepted. Perhaps Prunella feared what it would do to her own reputation. Still seems a lot to kill for. It always seems like a lot, Miss Marple replied. Until one remembers how very small some people's worlds are. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way up the narrow lane leading to the Briggs cottage on the village's outskirts. It was a modest place, with whitewashed walls and a slate roof, tucked behind overgrown hedges. Sally answered the door looking pale and flustered, as though she hadn't slept properly in days. "Miss Marple?" she said. "Is something wrong?" "No, dear. I was hoping you might join me for a little walk. The air does wonders when one is carrying questions." Sally hesitated, then nodded and fetched her coat. They walked together along the path by the old mill stream, boots crunching against pebbled earth. Birds chirped weakly overhead, and a low mist clung to the grass along the banks. "I've been thinking about you," Miss Marple said gently. "About your grandmother. You were raised by her, yes?" "Yes. She passed when I was 15. After that, I managed on my own." "She told you your parents had died in an accident?" "Yes. A train accident." "I never questioned it." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "there's no official record of such an accident involving your parents' names in that year." Sally stopped walking. "Yeah, I don't understand." Miss Marple turned to face her. Sometimes, the stories we're told are designed not to explain the truth, but to protect someone's idea of what is proper. But you deserve the truth, my dear. I believe Harold Fothergill was your father. Sally's lips parted, but no words came. She looked stricken less from disbelief and more from a sudden, violent recognition. I saw him once, she whispered. When I was little. He came to the cottage. I was sent outside to play. I remember peeking through the window. He gave my grandmother money. She was crying. Ms. Marple nodded. I believe he supported you financially, quietly. And for a time, perhaps that was enough for him. But not in the end. I think he meant to tell you. I think he had grown tired of secrets. Sally's voice shook. Why would anyone want to stop him? Ms. Marple hesitated. There are people in this village who benefit from what is not said. If Harold acknowledged you, others would be forced to confront their roles in the deception. Sally lowered her head. I just wanted to know who I was. And you shall, my dear, said Ms. Marple. But first we must make sure no one else is hurt by silence. That evening, just before dusk, Miss Marple returned home and found an envelope slipped under her front door. No stamp. Just her name. Inside was the torn photograph again. But this time, there was a note folded behind it. In careful block letters, "You're looking in the wrong place." She wasn't the only one with something to lose. Miss Marple read it 3 times. Then she turned back to her fire and sat very still. The fox-head pin. The velvet coat. The torn note. The promise of a confession. But now something had shifted. Someone else had something to lose. And it was time to look beyond the velvet and the gardener's feud. There was another player in this story. Someone who had blended into the background so perfectly they'd never even been considered. But Jane Marple, eyes gleaming in the firelight, had begun to see the outlying form. And she intended to follow Ida no matter how politely it had hidden behind smiles, cakes, or committee meetings. Because in Milchester, even niceties could kill. Chapter 7, The quiet one who watched. The following day dawned with the rain so fine and persistent it felt more like the village was being slowly dissolved than soaked. The rooftops of Milchester ran with silver threads, and the streets glistened like polished slate. Miss Marple, however, remained unaffected by the gloom. She had lived long enough to know that storms, the weather of the sky or the soula, often preceded clarity. She had spent the morning going over everything again, the photograph, the torn note, the fox-head pin, the gloves, the will, the anonymous letter. But it was that final sentence, she wasn't the only one with something to Lucia, that now echoed in her mind like a bell tolling at the wrong hour. For days, the village's attention had focused on Prunella Simmons and Arthur Welby. That was natural. They were the ones with the most visible history with Harold Fothergill. They were the names whispered over scones, the faces scrutinized in the post office queue. But the sender of the anonymous note, whoever they were, had urged her to look elsewhere. Someone else had been hiding in plain sight. Miss Marple's thoughts turned, curiously, to Mrs. Emery. Florence Emery had seemed almost peripheral until now. The village piano teacher. A woman of mild manners and moderate taste, whose only Crimea until now had been overly ambitious treacle tarts and a fondness for other people's business. She had been present at the garden show, of course she was always present. She had even been among the first to spread word of the Foxhead pin. And yet a broken bar, there was something just a little too convenient about how quickly she had connected the pin to Prunella Simmons. Something rehearsed. At precisely 11:30, Miss Marple slipped into her mackintosh, fetched her umbrella, and stepped out into the drizzle. Her path took her not to the rose thistle or the churchyard, but instead to a small brick house on Maple Tree Lane, Mrs. Emery's. The door was opened by Florence herself, who blinked in surprise. "Jane. What a fright you gave me. Do come in, do come in. I've just put on a fresh pot." Miss Marple entered with a warm smile. The drawing room was exactly as expected, tidy, floral, and slightly too pink. The tea service was laid out with impressive precision. "I was just thinking about you," Mrs. Emery chirped, bustling about. "This murder business, so frightful. Though if I'm being honest, it's done wonders for the foot traffic at the bakery. People always want pastry when they're discussing blood." Miss Marple offered a pleasant murmur, her eyes quietly absorbing the room. "Tell me, Florence," she said, once they were seated, "you've known nearly everyone in Milchester for, 20 years? Longer, I'd say." "I knew Harold before he married. You know, his first piano teacher was my cousin Isabel." "Did Harold ever strike you as a man with the broken bar secrets?" Florence paused mid-pour. "Don't we all have a few tucked away, dear?" Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "Some more damaging than others." Mrs. Emery smiled thinly. "What is this, Jane? A social call or an interrogation?" "Just an observation," Miss Marple said softly. "You've always had such a remarkable memory. Do you remember seeing anyone in gloves on the day of the garden show?" "Gloves?" Florence blinked. "Well, a broken bar number." "I don't think so. Except, of course, Prunella. She always wears gloves." "Part of her ridiculous airs." "Funny," said Miss Marple mildly. "Mr. Wicks, the groundskeeper, also mentioned a woman in gloves." "Not Prunella, though," said the coat was darker. Mrs. Emery's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. "Well, perhaps someone borrowed a coat." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. though it would be an odd coincidence that you were the one who pointed out the fox head pin before the police even mentioned it." A pause. "I'm just observant," Florence said. "Indeed. As am I. And I noticed that the pin wasn't shown to the public. It was found quietly by Constable Roper and handed to Sergeant Paris. So you must have heard it from some in a broken bar or seen it before the constable arrived." Silence settled over the room like a dropped curtain. Miss Marple continued gently, "The curious thing about murder, Florence, is that it tends to disturb old arrangements. Secrets become burdens. Allegiances crumble. And those who were once protected may suddenly find themselves vulnerable." Florence's composure was beginning to fray. Her voice, when she spoke, was lower, harder. "You think I killed Harold? I think you knew what he was about to do. I think you realized he would tell Sally the truth. That he had finally gathered the courage to speak the one secret that had kept so many bound in silence." Florence set her cup down with a loud clink. "It was his fault," she said sharply. "All of it. He knew what that truth would do, not just to Prunella or Arthur, but to Sally. And to me." Miss Marple waited. "She's my niece," Florence said, almost spitting the words. "Not my sister's child, as people believed. My daughter. From a time I'd rather forget. I gave her up to my mother and moved away. Then Harold came back offering his money, acting the savior." Tears sprang unbidden to her eyes. "He had no right to come back after all those years and play father. Not when he left me alone. Not when he ruined everything." Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "So when he told you he would speak to Sally, you followed him to the greenhouse?" "I didn't mean to hurt him," Florence whispered. "I just wanted to stop him. I tried to take the note. He pulled away and Tripita fell against the grates. It was an accident." "But you didn't call for help." "I panicked. I took the other half of the note. I left." "I didn't mean to." Miss Marple rose slowly. "I believe you didn't plan murder, Florence. But you did commit it." Outside, the rain had grown heavier. The windows misted at the edges. "Please," Florence said, voice hollow, "don't tell Sally. Let her remember him kindly. It's better that way." Ms. Marple turned to the door, her voice soft but resolute. "It's no longer about preserving illusions. It's about restoring what was denied. And she deserves the truth, however painful." An hour later, Miss Marple stood quietly in the small police office of Milchester, her statement delivered, her part complete. Sergeant Paris said nothing at first. He simply looked down at the confession Miss Marple had helped secure, then at the broken woman now sitting pale and silent in the holding room next door. "It's always the ones you least suspect," he said. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "It's always the ones who've been watching the longest." And she walked out into the rain, alone. Chapter 8 Truths Told in Twilight. The rain continued for most of the night, a steady murmur on rooftops and window panes, as if the village itself were mourning. Milchester, so often cloaked in the comfort of routine and pleasantries, now sat in a kind of suspended quiet like a theater where the curtain had dropped too soon. Miss Marple awoke early. She had slept soundly, not out of peace, but out of necessity. There is a particular exhaustion that comes after moral clarity, a kind of stillness that settles only once the burden of truth has been passed on. And now that it had, she knew her role was nearly complete. The police had taken Florence Emery into custody the night before. Her quiet, broken, but complete had made the task easier than most. Sergeant Paris had been respectful, even gentle, though his face had looked older than it had in the weeks prior. Miss Marple stood by the sitting-room window with her tea, watching the mist rise off the hedgerows. She thought of Florencia, once a lively girl in the village choir, then a watchful woman with too many regrets. It was a sad business. But then, most crimes were born not from evil, but from hurt left too long to fester. Just as she was setting her cup down, there came a knock at the front door. It was Sally. Her cheeks were flushed from the wind, her coat damp at the shoulders. But her eyes, though steady, uncertain eyes, held something different today. Not fear, but readiness. "I heard," she said simply, once Miss Marple had let her in. Miss Marple gestured toward the kitchen. "Would you like some tea, dear?" Sally shook her head. "Number. I don't think I can sit. I need to know. All of it. Please." Miss Marple nodded. She moved slowly to the fire and stirred it with the poker, more for rhythm than necessity. "Your grandmother, whom you believe to be your mother, was Florence Emery. She was young, unmarried, and afraid. When she became pregnant, she and her family decided to raise you under the appearance that you were her niece. Such arrangements are more common than people admit, particularly in villages where appearances are everything." Sally stood still, absorbing it. "Harold Fothergill," Miss Marple continued, "was your father. I believe he contributed financially, though he kept his involvement hidden. For years, he let the truth sit untouched. But something changed. Perhaps he regretted the silence. Perhaps he believed it was time you knew." Sally spoke softly. "He was going to tell me, wasn't he?" "That's what the note was." "Yes. He wrote it just before he died. Or rather, just before he was killed. He tried to speak to your mother, one last time. And she, in fear and desperation, tried to stop him." Sally closed her eyes. Miss Marple approached her gently. "She didn't intend to kill him, my dear. But her guilt, her panic led her to cover it up. That is the truth, painful as it is." Sally nodded, slowly. "All this time a broken bar I wanted to know who I was." "And now a broken bar you still are," said Miss Marple, placing a hand on hers. "You are kind. Honest. Brave. That is yours alone, not something inherited. But now, at least, the silence is gone. And with it, the shadow." There were no tears, not yet. Just a long breath that sounded like release. "I'm glad you told me," Sally said, "and then, what happens now?" Miss Marple sighed. "The law will take its course. But as for you, that is for you to decide. You are free now, Sally. And that is a rare thing." Later that day, the village began to shift its gaze once again. The news, though not shouted, made its way through cottages and shops like smoke on the wind. Mrs. Emery arrested. Harold Fothergill not tripped, but struck. And Sally Briggs, poor girl, left with the echo of too many truths. The rose thistle fell into an unusual hush. Conversations, once bursting with speculation and intrigue, now carried a relevant undertone. "She did it for the girl," said Miss Hartnell with a sigh. "Imagine a burden." "I suppose," muttered Mr. Peel, "but it's always the quiet ones, isn't it? The ones who notice too much." "I always said Florence had a storm behind her eyes," added Mrs. Blackwell, who had, in fact, never said any such thing before. But amid the murmuring, some chose silence. Prunella Simmons, for one, had not left her house since the arrest. Arthur Welby had been seen walking alone along the lane by the mill, hat in hand, head bowed. Miss Marple watched them all with the faintest sadness. The true damage of such events was not in the act itself, but in the ripples it left behind and the broken friendships, the shaken foundations, the memories recast in darker tones. Still, the truth was better than the illusion. Always. That evening, Reverend Pilling invited Miss Marple to the vicarage for a quiet supper. Over bowls of leek and potato soup, they spoke in the soft tones that follow a storm. "Do you ever grow tired of seeing the worst in people?" he asked gently. "I never see the worst," Miss Marple replied. "Only the parts they try hardest to hide." He smiled. "You've done something good, Jane." "For the village." "For Sally." "Perhaps," she said. "But it would have been better if someone had done it sooner." Secrets rot like fruit left in the sun. The fire crackled in the hearth beside them, and the rain had finally stopped. Outside, the moon emerged over Milchester, shy but steady. Later, as Miss Marple returned to her cottage and slipped out of her coat, she noticed a small envelope had been tucked under the front door again. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single scrap of paper. No name. No handwriting. Just one line, typed, "Thank you for giving me back my name." Miss Marple read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it on the mantel. She looked around the quiet room, familiar, warm, unchanged, and gave a small nod to herself. Another shadow gone. Another secret turned to light. Chapter 9, Ashes in the Greenhouse. It was the following morning when Miss Marple received the unexpected visit. The day had begun peacefully. The skies were clear for the first time in a week, and a mild sun dappled her front garden. She had just settled into her armchair with a fresh cup of tea and the latest letter from her nephew Raymond, full of amusing complaints about a failed literary luncheon in Oxford, when she heard brisk footsteps on the gravel outside. A moment later, the knock came. It was Sergeant Paris. He looked less tense than in previous days, but there was a flicker of curiosity behind his tired eyes, an expression Miss Marple had learned to associate with something unresolved. "Good morning, Sergeant," she said as she opened the door. "Come in, come in. You look as though you've come with a thought you don't quite trust yet." Paris smiled thinly. "That's not far off, ma'am." He followed her into the sitting room, accepted a cup of tea with habitual politeness, and sat stiffly on the edge of the armchair, as if unsure how long he meant to stay. "I've come from the greenhouse," he began. "We've been doing a final sweep, a routine, really. The murder scene's been processed, but we hadn't yet cleared the storage boxes behind the main bench. The corner where Harold used to keep old seed trays and potting soil." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And we found ashes. Not unusual in a potting shed." Paris held up a hand. "Not wood ashes, Miss Marple. Paper. Burnt documents. Some partly intact." Now she leaned forward slightly. "We've managed to piece together some of what was burned. Pages from a diary or a personal notebook, we think. They weren't all Harold's handwriting, either. There are two distinct hands." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "And what did they say?" "Nothing directly incriminating. But one line stood out. It was scrawled in red pencil, If she ever finds out the child is hers, it will undo everything." Miss Marple paused, cup halfway to her lips. "The child is hers?" Paris nodded. "We don't know who Ashy is, or what arrangement it refers to. But the phrasing suggests that even the version of events we know of Florence's story, Harold's plan to tell Sally, might not be the full truth." Miss Marple sat back slowly, her expression unreadable. "You believe someone else was involved in hiding Sally's true identity?" "I think," Paris said quietly, "that perhaps Florence wasn't the only one with something to protect. And maybe not even the worst offender." That afternoon, Miss Marple walked alone to the edge of Milchester, toward the very plot where the old greenhouse stood. The vicarage was quiet. Reverend Pilling was away for the day attending a funeral in South Denham, and the grounds were empty but for the birds in the wind. The greenhouse, long associated with Harold Fothergill and his prize chrysanthemums, was padlocked now, the door half hinged, its frame beginning to show wear. but the side bench of the one where the ashes had been found was still accessible through the small broken pane Harold had meant to repair for months. She reached in carefully with her umbrella and tapped open the bench's lid. Inside were only remnants now, soil-stained rags, fragments of terracotta pots, and the faint scent of burned paper. Miss Marple stood very still, eyes narrowing. There was something else, a slip of oilcloth at the base of the bench, pressed flat beneath a pile of empty sea trays. She knelt carefully and drew it out. Wrapped inside was a single object, a pocket mirror. Cracked, worn. Not valuable. But it bore the initials P.S. Prunella Simmons. Miss Marple rose, slowly brushing the dirt from her skirt. She had no proof, not yet, but her instincts had shifted. Florence had believed she was protecting a lie she'd carried for years. But what if the lie was handed to her? What if Florence had not been the mother at all but Prunella? And what if Harold had finally decided to correct that lie, to give Sally not just her father's name, but her mother's too? That would explain the desperation. The urgency in the note. The sense that Sally needed to know before Harold passed. And it would explain the panic in Prunella's eyes when Miss Marple had last visited. Miss Marple did not go directly to Prunella's that day. She returned home instead, prepared a light supper, and sat with her notebook, outlining every event again from the beginning. Sally was raised believing Florence was her aunt. Harold supported her education quietly, visited rarely. Florence carried the secret for decades but it was never spoken aloud, not even in confession. Prunella had remained unusually quiet during the investigation. And the fox had Pina, yes, it had been hers. But had she been present that day after all? Florence had claimed she hadn't seen Harold since November. But Prunella? She had lied openly to Miss Marple about her movements at the garden show. And that changed everything. The next day, Miss Marple returned to Prunella's cottage on Sycamore Lane. She found the older woman in her drawing room, sipping brandy at 10 in the morning, her hands fidgeting with the edge of a handkerchief. "I wondered when you'd come," she said, her voice brittle. "It's been awful." Poor Florence. Miss Marple sat down across from her and offered a gentle nod. "Indeed. Poor Florence." There was a long pause. Then Miss Marple said, "I found something in the greenhouse." Prunella's hand stilled. "Something of yours," Miss Marple continued softly. "A mirror. With your initials." It was wrapped and hidden beneath a pile of seed trays. Prunella closed her eyes. Miss Marple's voice dropped further. "I believe you were there that day. I believe Harold told you he was going to tell Sally the truth, not about Florence, but about you." Prunella didn't speak. "I think he asked you to step forward. To take responsibility for the life you'd hidden. And I think you refused. " Perhaps you even threatened to expose Florence's arrangement." Perhaps you burned the rest of the letters he had written to Sally. Perhaps you meant only to frighten him. A broken bar. A long silence followed. Then Prunella said, very softly, I gave her up. My parents insisted. Florence took her on, said she would raise her as a sister. I went on with my life. Married someone else. I never saw Sally again until she was 10. And by then a broken bar. I couldn't a broken bar. I didn't know how to go back. Her voice cracked. But Hilda, he was going to ruin everything. My whole life. All those years of keeping the secret for nothing. Miss Marple stared at her with quiet, unwavering eyes. You didn't kill him, she said. But you pushed him. Prunella looked away. Miss Marple stood, her voice neither cruel nor kind. The police will decide what to do with that. But I suggest, for Sally's sake, you tell the truth. She deserves her whole story and not just the version that suits your dignity. As she walked to the door, Prunella called out, not pleading, but hollow. Do you think she'll ever forgive me? Miss Marple turned. Forgiveness must be earned. But truth is the first step. She left the cottage with the wind behind her, rustling the sycamore leaves like whispers. There were still shadows to clear. But the light had finally begun to spread. Chapter 10, The Shape of the Truth. The sun hung low over Milchester that Sunday evening, casting a soft gold over the churchyard and bathing the village cottages in a warm, forgiving light. It was a rare stillness, the kind that only came after a storm, when the air felt lighter, not from joy, but from the burden of truth finally spoken. Inside the vicarage hall, chairs had been arranged in quiet rows, the kind used for committee meetings and charity concerts. But tonight, there were no scones, no bunting. Only a small circle of villagers: Miss Marple, Sergeant Paris, Reverend Pilling, Sally Briggs, and, seated stiffly apart from the rest, Prunella Simmons. She had come, which surprised everyone. No summons, no arrest. Merely a note from Miss Marple requesting her presence, and she had arrived dressed not in her usual velveteen fox fur, but in a plain navy coat, her face drawn and stripped of its usual theater. Miss Marple stood at the center, hands folded, quiet as always. I've asked you all here, she began gently, because there are times when the court cannot resolve what the village must live with. This is one of those times. Sally sat quietly in the front row. Her gaze never left Miss Marple, though the woman seated behind her real mother drew the occasional glance like a shadow passing through light. Harold Fothergill did not die by accident, Miss Marple said. We know this now. He was killed in a moment of panic by a woman who feared that a long-held secret would finally come to light. She nodded toward the back. That woman was Florence Emery. She confessed to Ida sincerely and fully, and she will answer for it. But in her confession, she also said something we now know was untrue. She claimed she was Sally's mother. She was not. A hush settled over the room, though no one gasped. Most had suspected it in some way. But there is a difference between gossip and confirmed truth. Prunella Simmons, Miss Marple said calmly, is Sally's mother. Prunella did not move. She sat ramrod straight, her hands white-knuckled on her lap. For years, she lived with the knowledge and said nothing. She allowed Florence to carry the burden of raising Sally under a lie, protecting a reputation that had already faded. And when Harold Fothergill decided to tell the truth, to give Sally the name and identity she deserved, it frightened her. Miss Marple's eyes didn't flinch. She went to the greenhouse to stop him. They argued. In the struggle, he fell. She left, unseen. And later, Florence arrived and found what she believed was the unraveling of the very lie she had spent her life protecting. She completed the concealment and not knowing she was covering for someone else. Sally turned around slowly. Her gaze met Prunella's. There was no fury in her eyes. Only ache. I didn't mean to let it go on so long, Prunella whispered. I was a girl. Scared. My family insisted we hide it. They sent me away. When I came back, Florence had taken you in. She said you were better off never knowing. She said we'd ruined your chance at a normal life. Tears slid down her cheeks, ungracefully. I wanted to tell you. So many times. But each year made it harder. And by the time Harold came back into our lives, I wasn't brave enough. Sally did not respond at first. But after a long silence, she spoke not to Miss Marple, not to the others, but directly to the woman who had once chosen pride over truth. You should have told me, she said. You should have told me before I had to learn it from someone else. Then she stood and walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused and turned slightly. But I'm glad I know now. Whoever I am, at